Hello there, seeker of silence. Come a little closer, if you will. The hour has settled into that gentle space between night and memory, where the world loosens its hold and stories begin to wander more freely. There is a certain comfort in these moments, when the distant things of the day fade and the mind finds its way toward quieter paths. If these quiet stories bring you peace, feel free to subscribe, so that whenever another tale is told beneath dim firelight, you may find your way back again. Now then, let us begin. High among the hidden valleys of the world, where the last light of evening lingers upon pale stone and silver leaves, there stands a place known only to a few. Rivendell, the last homely house, rests between steep slopes and winding waters, sheltered from the restless movements of the outside world. By day it is a place of song and counsel, but by night, when the halls grow still and the lanterns burn low, another kind of work quietly continues. In a chamber tucked deep within the eastern wing, where tall windows open toward the sound of falling water, a single lamp flickered beside a wide wooden table. Its light fell across scrolls and maps, spread in careful layers, their edges curling slightly with age. There sat Ilarion, a cartographer of the elves. His hair, dark as the shadow beneath ancient trees, was drawn loosely behind his shoulders, though a few strands had escaped and now rested across his brow. His gaze moved slowly over the parchment before him, tracing lines inked long ago, routes that twisted through forests no longer standing, passes that had vanished beneath stone, and roads that few now dared to remember. A faint sound of rushing water drifted through the open window, blending with the soft scratch of quill against parchment. Ilarion paused, lifting the quill just above the map as though listening to something distant, something carried not by sound, but by memory. Before him lay a chart unlike the others. Its surface was marked not with clear roads or well-known lands, but with faint, almost uncertain lines. They wove between the roots of the Misty Mountains, slipping through narrow passes and hidden valleys, places where even the keenest traveler might lose their way. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. "These were not meant to be forgotten," he murmured, his voice low as though mindful of the hour. At the edge of the map, written in a delicate and older script, was a single phrase: "The paths that wait." Ilarion rested his hand upon the parchment, his fingers lightly pressing against the faded ink. He had seen references to these paths before, fragments in old records, half-finished notes, mentions within songs that were no longer sung in full. Routes that did not appear on common maps. Routes that seemed to shift. A small breath left him as he reached for another scroll, unrolling it beside the first. This one bore the marks of recent work, his own hand, precise and patient, layering new understanding over ancient memory. The two maps did not align. Where one showed a narrow pass, the other revealed no path at all. Where a river bent eastward, the older chart traced it south, vanishing beneath a symbol that no longer had a clear meaning. Ilarion tilted his head slightly, considering. The lamp flame flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the table. He rose slowly, stepping away from the maps, and crossed the chamber toward a tall shelf carved into the stone wall. There, among bound volumes and rolled parchments, he searched with careful familiarity, his fingers brushing along the spines until they paused upon a narrow case. He drew it free. Inside lay a collection of fragments, small pieces of older maps, brittle at the edges, their markings faded but not entirely lost. Returning to the table, he placed them gently beside the larger charts and began to arrange them, turning each piece until it found its place within the wider pattern. Time passed in quiet measure. The night deepened beyond the window, and the stars emerged one by one above the valley. Their light, pale and distant, mingled with the glow of the lamp, creating a soft contrast between sky and stone. At last, Ilarion leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. The fragments, when aligned with care, revealed something unexpected. Not a single path, but many. A network, subtle and shifting, woven through the lands beyond Rivendell. Some led toward the high ridges of the mountains, others descended into valleys long abandoned. A few curved in ways that defied simple direction, as though following not the shape of the land but something older, something unseen. Ilarion's gaze lingered on one such line. It began near the borders of Rivendell itself, just beyond the known trails, and wound northward through a narrow passage marked only by a faint symbol, a circle broken by a single line. He did not recognize it, and yet it felt familiar. He reached for his quill once more, hesitating for just a moment before placing its tip upon the parchment. Carefully, he traced the hidden route, reinforcing its presence upon the map. The ink flowed smoothly, dark against the pale surface. Outside, the sound of water continued its steady rhythm, and a cool breeze slipped through the window, stirring the edges of the scattered pages. Ilarion set the quill aside. There was a sense, faint but unmistakable, that this work was not merely the study of old paths. It was the beginning of something. Not a journey yet, but the quiet turning of a thought toward movement. He stood once more, stepping toward the window, and looked out across the valley of Rivendell. The lights within the house had dimmed, leaving only a few distant glows along the terraces. Beyond them, the land stretched into darkness, the outlines of hills and trees blending into shadow. And somewhere beyond those hills, the hidden paths waited. Ilarion remained there for a time, his gaze steady, as though measuring a distance that could not yet be seen. Then, with a final glance toward the maps behind him, he turned back into the chamber. The night was not yet over, and neither, it seemed, was the work. Ilarion returned to the table with unhurried steps, though something within his thoughts had begun to stir with quiet purpose. The maps lay where he had left them, their lines and markings holding the faint glow of the lamp as though waiting for his return. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he moved around the table, viewing the arrangement from a different angle, as if a shift in perspective might reveal what had not yet been seen. His eyes followed the newly traced route once more, from its subtle beginning near Rivendell's edge to the point where it vanished into uncertain terrain. There was no clear destination, only continuation. He reached for a small wooden instrument resting among his tools, a compass of delicate design, its casing etched with patterns of intertwining leaves. When opened, its needle did not point north in the manner of ordinary devices. It drifted almost thoughtfully before settling in a direction that seemed guided by something other than the world's poles. Ilarion watched it for a moment. Then, with careful precision, he placed it upon the map, just beside the faint symbol of the broken circle. The needle trembled slightly, then turned. Not sharply, not with sudden intent, but with a slow and steady motion, aligning itself along the very path he had traced. A small breath escaped him, more from recognition than surprise. "So it remains," he said, though no one stood to hear it. He closed the compass and set it aside. The fragments, the shifting lines, the old markings, they were not merely remnants of forgotten geography. They were something more deliberate, something preserved with intention, even as the world around them changed. He gathered the smaller pieces of parchment and stacked them carefully, binding them with a narrow strip of cloth. The larger maps he rolled with equal care, securing them with cords worn smooth by use. Only the primary chart, the one bearing the hidden paths, remained upon the table. Ilarion studied it once more. Then, as though a decision had quietly settled into place, he reached for a case resting beneath the edge of the table. From it, He withdrew a satchel of dark leather, worn but well kept, its surface marked by years of careful travel. He opened it and began to place the map within. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the weight of intention. When the map was secured, he fastened the satchel and set it gently upon the table. His gaze lingered on it for a moment, as if acknowledging what it now represented. A journey not yet begun, but no longer distant. The chamber remained still around him. The lamp burned steadily. The distant water continued its endless descent through the valley. Somewhere beyond the walls, the faint rustle of leaves answered the passing breeze. Ilarion turned once more toward the shelves, selecting a few additional items. Small tools, a rolled length of fine cord, a narrow-bladed knife set within a plain sheath. Each was chosen with quiet certainty, placed within the satchel without haste. At last, he paused. His hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, and his eyes moved once more across the room. The maps now gathered, the lamp casting its steady light, the window open to the night. There was no urgency, only readiness. He crossed to the lamp and adjusted the wick slightly, lowering the flame so that it burned with a softer glow. The shadows deepened, stretching along the stone walls, but the chamber did not fall into darkness. Not yet. Then, with a final glance toward the table, Ilarion turned and stepped out into the corridor beyond. The halls of Rivendell at night held a different kind of presence than they did by day. Where once there had been voices, music, and the gentle flow of conversation, now there was only the quiet passage of time. Lanterns hung at intervals along the walls, their light warm and steady, illuminating carved pillars and arching ceilings that seemed to echo with memory. Ilarion walked without hurry. His steps made little sound upon the smooth stone, and though his path was certain, there was no sense of departure in it. Not yet. He passed through a long corridor that opened onto a balcony overlooking the valley. The air here was cooler, touched by the descent of water from the heights above. The stars shone clearly overhead, their light reflecting faintly upon the distant river. For a moment he paused. Leaning lightly against the stone railing, he looked out across the land once more. The shapes of trees and hills lay in layered shadow, their edges softened by distance. Somewhere beyond them, the path he had traced waited in stillness. He could not yet see it, but he knew where it began. A faint sound reached him then, not the water nor the wind, but something closer. The light step of another moving along the corridor behind him. Ilarion turned slightly. An elf approached, her presence as natural to the night as the stars above. Her hair, pale as starlight itself, fell in a smooth cascade over her shoulders, and her gaze held a quiet awareness, as though she had long known where to look. "Ilanion," she said softly. Ilarion inclined his head. "Lyriel." She came to stand beside him, her eyes following his toward the valley below. For a time neither spoke. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she said, "You have been working late, as I often do, and yet tonight feels different." Ilarion allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch his expression. "The maps have changed," he said. "Or perhaps," Lyriel replied, "you have begun to see them differently." He considered this, his gaze returning briefly to the distance. Perhaps both. She did not press further. Instead, she reached into the folds of her cloak and withdrew a small object, a slender piece of silver shaped like a leaf, its surface etched with fine lines that caught the starlight. "For the road," she said, offering it to him. Ilarion looked at it, then at her. "I have not yet said I would go." "No," Lyriel answered gently, "but you have already begun." He accepted the token, turning it lightly between his fingers. It felt cool, balanced, as though crafted with care for more than ornament. "A marker?" he asked. "A reminder," she said, "of where paths begin and where they return." Ilarion nodded, slipping the silver leaf into the satchel at his side. Again they stood in stillness, the valley before them, the night stretched wide above. At length Lyriel stepped back. "The eastern gate will be open at first light," she said. Ilarion glanced toward her, but she had already begun to move away, her steps as quiet as they had been upon her approach. He watched her go for a moment, then turned once more toward the valley. The thought that had begun in the quiet of the chamber now settled more firmly within him, not as a question, but as a path. And beyond the slopes and trees where the known roads ended, something waited to be found. The hours passed in a quiet unfolding, measured not by urgency, but by the slow turning of the night toward morning. Ilarion did not return at once to his chamber. Instead, he wandered the familiar paths within Rivendell, as though tracing in his own way the shape of a place he had long known, but now saw with new attention. The corridors, the open terraces, the narrow bridges that crossed gentle streams, all of it carried a sense of quiet continuity, unchanged even as time moved onward. He passed beneath arching stone and woven vines, where lanterns cast their steady glow upon polished floors. At times he paused, not out of hesitation, but simply to observe how the light fell upon the carvings, how the faint sound of water carried through the air, how the distant trees shifted with the passing breeze. It was not departure, he felt, but alignment. Eventually, his steps led him downward, along a series of gently curving paths that wound through the lower gardens. Here, the scent of growing things lingered faintly, even at this hour, and the ground held the coolness of the night beneath his feet. A narrow stream crossed his path, its surface reflecting the stars in fragments of light. He stepped across a small stone bridge, pausing briefly at its center. The water moved steadily beneath him, neither hurried nor still. For a moment he rested his hand upon the edge of the bridge, his gaze following the current as it slipped into shadow beyond the trees. Then he continued on. At the far edge of the gardens stood a small structure, half hidden by ivy and low branches. Its door was open, and within, a faint light burned, dim, but present. Ilarion approached without sound. Inside, the space was modest, its walls lined with shelves of small objects, tools, fragments of stone, pieces of wood carved with care. At the center stood a low table, upon which a single candle flickered beside a collection of instruments, both familiar and strange. An elf stood there, his back turned, his hands moving with quiet precision over a device of thin metal rings. He did not look up as Ilarion entered. "You have brought the maps," he said, his voice steady. Ilarion stepped forward, the satchel resting lightly against his side. "I have." The other elf nodded slightly, adjusting the rings before him so that they aligned in a careful pattern. Only then did he turn. His name was Calanhir, a craftsman of subtle works, known not for what he made, but for how he understood the things that others overlooked. His eyes, bright and attentive, settled briefly on the satchel. "And you have followed them," he added. Ilarion considered the words, then inclined his head. "In part." Calanhir allowed a faint smile. "That is often how such things begin." He gestured lightly toward the table. "May I?" Ilarion unfastened the satchel and drew forth the map, placing it carefully upon the surface. The candlelight caught the inked lines, revealing once more the hidden paths in their quiet complexity. Calanhir leaned in, his gaze moving slowly across the parchment. He did not speak at once. Instead, he reached for a small instrument, a slender rod tipped with a faintly glowing stone, and passed it gently over the map. Where the light touched the surface, certain lines seemed to deepen, while others faded slightly, as though responding to the presence of the glow. Ilarion watched in stillness. After a time, Calanhir set the instrument aside. "These are not fixed roads," he said. "I have seen as much." "They follow patterns," Calanhir continued, "but not those of the land alone. They respond hard to memory, to passage, to things that leave no mark upon ordinary maps." Ilarion's gaze returned to the broken circle symbol. "And this?" Calanhir studied it, his expression thoughtful. "A threshold, perhaps," he said at last, "or a marker of transition. It appears in older works, though rarely with clarity." He reached beneath the table and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. With careful movements, he unwrapped it, revealing a thin disc of pale metal, no larger than the palm of his hand. Its surface bore a marking, one that echoed the symbol upon the map, a circle broken by a single line. Ilarion's eyes narrowed slightly. "You have seen it before." "Not in this context," Calanhir replied, "but its meaning is not entirely lost." He turned the disc slowly, allowing the candlelight to trace its edges. "It is said to mark places where paths may shift, where what lies beyond is not always the same as what lies before." Ilarion absorbed this in silence. The thought did not unsettle him, but it deepened the sense of what the map represented. Calanhir placed the disc beside the parchment. "If you follow this route," he said, his tone measured, "you may find more than a forgotten road." Ilarion inclined his head. "That is often the nature of such things." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Calanhir stepped back slightly, folding the cloth once more around the disc, though he did not take it away. "You will go at first light." It was not a question. Ilarion's hand rested lightly against the edge of the table. "Yes." Calanhir nodded, as though the answer had long been expected. "Then take this." He offered the wrapped disc. Ilarion looked at it, then at Calanhir. "It may serve as a guide," Calanhir said, "or simply as a reminder. In either case, it belongs not here, but along the path you intend to follow." Ilarion accepted it, feeling the weight of the metal through the cloth, light yet present. "I will return it." Calanhir's faint smile returned. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps it will return in another way." Ilarion secured the disc within his satchel, beside the map and the silver leaf. The items rested there now as a quiet collection, each bearing its own purpose, though not all were yet fully understood. He looked once more at the map, then rolled it with care and placed it back within the satchel. When he straightened, Calanhir had already turned back to his work, his hands once more adjusting the delicate rings upon the table. The conversation had reached its natural end. Ilarion inclined his head in farewell and stepped out into the garden once more. The eastern sky had begun to change. Not with the full light of morning, but with the first faint suggestion of it. A subtle softening of the darkness, a shift that could be felt more than seen. Ilarion followed the winding paths upward, leaving behind the gardens and returning toward the higher terraces. The air carried a slight coolness, touched now by the approach of dawn. As he walked, the sounds of Rivendell began to stir once more. A distant footstep here, a faint voice there, the gentle preparation of a place awakening without haste. By the time he reached the upper level, the horizon held a thin line of pale light. Ilarion paused. The satchel rested securely at his side. The map, the disc, the silver leaf. All were in place. Before him lay the final stretch of stone path leading toward the eastern gate. He did not yet move forward. Instead, he allowed himself a moment to stand there between what had been and what would follow, the quiet balance of the two held within the stillness of the early hour. Then, with a single step, he continued on. The eastern gate of Rivendell stood where the valley opened toward the wider lands, set between tall pillars of pale stone veined with age and memory. Ivy traced its way along the carved surfaces, and above, slender arches framed the first light of morning as it spread slowly across the horizon. Ilarion approached as the sky shifted from deep blue into a softer shade, touched by silver and faint gold. The air carried a clarity that belonged only to this hour, when the world had not yet fully stirred, and each sound seemed to travel farther than it would by day. Two figures stood near the gate, their cloaks drawn lightly about them, their presence watchful but unhurried. They inclined their heads as Ilarion drew near, offering no questions, only recognition. "Will you take the southern road?" one of them asked. Ilarion shook his head slightly. "Not this time." The other glanced beyond him, toward the terraces of Rivendell that rose in quiet layers behind. "Then you will leave the marked paths early." Yes. There was no further exchange. The gate did not require ceremony, nor did departure call for more than acknowledgement. Ilarion stepped forward, passing between the pillars and out into the open land beyond. The path that lay before him was, at first, familiar. A narrow trail wound its way downward from the valley, bordered by trees whose branches reached across the space above, filtering the growing light into shifting patterns upon the ground. The sound of water followed him for a time, fading gradually as the river curved away behind the hills. He walked without haste, his steps steady, his gaze attentive. The satchel rested lightly against his side, its contents present not as weight, but as quiet purpose. The map, now rolled and secured, did not need to be consulted yet. The beginning of the path required no guidance, but as the trail descended further, it began to change. The ground grew less certain beneath his feet, the edges of the path softening, blending into the surrounding earth. What had once been a clearly worn route became something less defined, as though fewer travelers had passed this way in recent years. Ilarion slowed slightly, observing. A fallen branch lay across the trail, its bark worn smooth in places. Moss had begun to claim its surface, spreading in small, uneven patches. Beyond it, the path curved, but not as it had before. Not quite. He stepped over the branch and continued, his attention shifting now from the path itself to the space around it. The arrangement of stones, the angle of the trees, the subtle rise and fall of the ground. These were not changes of neglect, they were adjustments. After some distance, the trail divided. One branch continued forward, wider and more certain, its course leading toward the known crossings beyond the hills. The other, narrower and less distinct, turned slightly northward, slipping between two low ridges where the trees grew closer together. Ilarion came to a stop. For a moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, he reached into the satchel and withdrew the map. He unrolled it with care, allowing the parchment to settle in his hands. The inked lines lay before him once more, the hidden paths weaving across its surface in patterns that did not immediately reveal their meaning. He found the point near Rivendell's edge, then followed the faint line outward. It did not align with the broader trail. Instead, it curved gently northward, toward the narrower path. Ilarion folded the map again, returning it to the satchel without hesitation. He stepped onto the less certain trail. The air seemed different here, not heavier nor lighter, but altered in a way that did not rely on simple measure. The sounds of the world, distant birds, the movement of leaves, the faint stir of wind, felt slightly removed, as though filtered through a space that did not fully belong to the ordinary flow of things. Ilarion walked on. The trees closed in somewhat, their branches forming a loose canopy overhead. Light passed through in shifting fragments, tracing patterns along the ground that moved with the slow passage of time. At intervals, the path appeared to fade entirely. Where it did, Ilarion did not stop. He continued forward, guided not by visible marks alone, but by a quiet sense of direction that seemed to settle within him as naturally as breath. The line he had traced upon the map lingered in his mind, not as a strict guide, but as a presence, subtle yet certain. After a time, the ground began to rise. The trees thinned slightly, giving way to a stretch of uneven stone and scattered grass. The ridges on either side drew closer together, forming a narrow passage that led upward between them. Ilarion followed it. The climb was gentle but steady, the path beneath his feet shifting between earth and stone. Small fragments of rock had fallen along the way, their surfaces worn smooth, their edges softened by years of quiet passage. At the top of the rise, the land opened. Before him lay a shallow valley, its floor covered in low grass that moved faintly with the breeze. A small stream crossed it from east to west, its surface catching the early light in narrow lines of silver. Ilarion stepped forward, descending toward the water. As he approached, he slowed. There was something here, not a sound nor a movement, but a presence that did not quite belong to the visible world. He reached the edge of the stream and paused. The water flowed steadily, its surface clear, revealing the smooth stones beneath. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing shifted beyond what the current carried, and yet Ilarion knelt slightly, his gaze fixed upon a point near the center of the stream. There, just beneath the surface, the light bent in an unusual way. Not sharply, not in a manner that drew immediate attention, but subtly, as though something unseen rested within the flow, altering its path without breaking it. He remained still, observing. After a moment, he reached into the satchel and withdrew the wrapped disc Callan here had given him. He unwrapped it carefully. The pale metal caught the morning light, its etched symbol reflecting faintly as he held it just above the surface of the water. For a breath, nothing changed. Then, slowly, the reflection shifted. The broken circle upon the disc aligned with the distortion in the stream, and for a brief moment the water seemed to part, not physically, but in perception, revealing a faint line beneath, a continuation of the path that did not exist upon the surface. Ilarion's gaze followed it. The line extended across the stream, rising on the far side, then continuing into the valley beyond. A path hidden not by absence, but by concealment. He lowered the disc, the surface of the water returning to its ordinary state. For a moment he remained where he was, the quiet understanding settling into place. Then he stood. Without hesitation, he stepped into the stream. The water moved around his boots, cool and steady, its flow unchanged by his presence. He crossed to the far side, ascending the bank where the hidden line had revealed itself. Once there, he paused briefly. The path ahead was not visible in the usual sense, and yet it was there. He took a step forward. The ground beneath his foot held firm. Another step, then another. The valley lay open around him, unchanged to the eye. But the path had begun. Beyond the stream, the valley stretched with an unassuming stillness, its gentle slopes rising and falling as though shaped by time alone. No clear trail marked the way forward, no worn earth or scattered stones to guide the step. And yet, the path continued. Ilarion moved with measured certainty, his gaze not fixed upon the ground alone, but upon the space just ahead, where something subtle seemed to settle, like a thought forming before it was spoken. Each step found its place. The grass bent beneath his feet, though it bore no lasting impression. The air shifted faintly as he passed, carrying with it the distant scent of stone warmed by the first light. He did not look back. The stream, now behind him, had already begun to blend into the quiet of the valley, its presence no longer distinct. Ahead, the land rose slightly, forming a gradual incline that led toward a line of low hills. As he approached, the texture of the ground changed. The grass gave way to scattered patches of pale earth, where thin lines, almost like faint impressions, traced across the surface. They did not form a clear pattern, but they echoed something he had seen before. Ilarion slowed. He reached into the satchel and withdrew the map once more, unrolling it carefully as he walked a few steps further. The inked lines, though unchanged, seemed to align more closely with the land around him now. Not perfectly, but with intention. He traced one of the hidden routes with his finger, following its subtle curve across the parchment. Then he lowered the map and looked ahead. The hills before him rose in uneven shapes, their slopes dotted with clusters of stone and sparse trees. At first glance, they appeared unremarkable, no different from the countless rises that marked the lands beyond Rivendell. But as Ilarion's gaze lingered, a pattern began to emerge. The stones were not scattered at random. They formed quiet alignments, lines that shifted slightly depending on the angle from which they were viewed. From where he stood, they seemed almost to echo the same winding motion as the hidden paths upon the map. He folded the parchment and returned it to the satchel. Then he continued forward. The ascent into the hills was gradual, the ground firm beneath his steps. Small stones shifted occasionally underfoot, but none broke the steady rhythm of his movement. As he climbed, the air grew cooler. A faint wind moved across the slopes, brushing lightly against the grass and carrying with it a distant, hollow sound. Not quite a voice, not quite the wind itself, but something that lingered between the two. Ilarion did not turn toward it. He continued upward, his attention held by the path that revealed itself only as he moved. At the crest of the first hill, he paused. The land beyond opened into a wider expanse, where the hills descended into a shallow basin, scattered with larger stones. Some stood upright, weathered by time, their surfaces marked with faint carvings that had long since softened into near invisibility. Ilarion descended toward them. As he drew closer, the carvings became slightly more distinct, not in clarity, but in presence. Lines curved across the stone, intersecting in ways that suggested meaning, though not one easily read. He approached one of the standing stones and placed his hand lightly against its surface. The stone was cool. Beneath his touch, the faint grooves of the carving traced a shape, not unlike the symbol he had seen before. A circle, incomplete, crossed by a single line. Ilarion's gaze shifted toward the others. Each stone bore a variation of the same marking, not identical, but related. He stepped back, his eyes moving across the arrangement. They formed no obvious circle, no simple pattern. And yet, when viewed from a certain angle, their placement began to align, not as a boundary, but as a continuation. A passage. Ilarion reached into the satchel once more, drawing out the disc. He held it loosely at his side for a moment, then raised it slightly, allowing the pale metal to catch the light. The surface of the disc reflected the stones before him. For a brief instant, the alignment shifted. The stones, though unchanged, seemed to draw into a clearer relation with one another, their positions forming a subtle arc that extended beyond the basin, toward a narrow opening between two larger hills. Ilarion lowered the disc. The alignment faded, but the direction remained. He moved forward, passing between the standing stones, his steps unhurried. As he did, the hollow sound in the air deepened slightly, as though the wind had found a different path through the land. Not louder, just nearer. He did not resist it, nor did he follow it directly. He simply continued along the path that revealed itself with each step. The narrow opening between the hills led into a passage of stone. The ground here was firmer, the surface worn smooth in places, though no clear sign of frequent travel could be seen. The walls on either side rose gradually, not steep, but enough to create a sense of enclosure. Light filtered down from above in thin, shifting bands. Ilarion walked within this space, his presence moving through it as though following a line drawn long before his arrival. After some distance, the passage curved, and as it did, the sound of the wind faded. In its place, there came a stillness, not empty, but held, as though the space itself carried a memory of movement that no longer occurred. Ilarion slowed. Ahead, the passage opened once more, revealing a small clearing enclosed by stone on three sides. At its center stood a single object, a low, flat surface of pale rock, its edges smooth, its form deliberate. He approached it. The surface bore no visible carving, no mark, and yet, as he stood before it, the sense of the path shifted again, not outward this time, but inward. Ilarion placed the disc upon the stone. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, faintly, the air seemed to move, not around him, but through the space itself. The light shifted slightly, its angle altering in a way that did not match the position of the sun. Ilarion remained still. The path was not ahead, nor behind. It was here. He looked down at the stone, then at the disc resting upon it. The broken circle, the line, a threshold. He reached out, placing his hand beside the disc, his fingers resting lightly against the surface of the rock. The air held its quiet tension, not waiting, but allowing. Ilarion did not rush. He simply remained there, his presence aligned with the space, as though listening for something that did not speak in sound. And slowly, the path changed once more. For a time, nothing seemed to move. The stone beneath Ilarion's hand remained cool and steady, its surface unchanged to the eye. The disc lay where he had placed it, its pale form catching only a thin trace of light. And yet, the space around him had begun to shift, not in form, but in feeling. The air held a quiet tension, like the moment before a word is spoken, or the instant between one step and the next when the ground has not yet been touched. Ilarion did not withdraw his hand. He let the stillness settle. Gradually, the light within the clearing altered, so subtly that it might have gone unnoticed had he not been watching. The shadows along the stone walls seemed to deepen, not from darkness, but from a gentle change in their angle. The passage behind him felt farther. Not distant, but less immediate. He lifted his gaze. Before him, where there had only been the smooth curve of stone, a faint impression had begun to form, not visible as a clear opening, but as a difference in the way the light met the surface, a suggestion of depth. Ilarion removed his hand from the stone. The disc remained. For a moment, he considered it, then left it where it rested. The path did not require him to carry everything forward. With measured steps, he moved toward the place where the air seemed to bend. As he approached, the sense of space shifted again. The clearing did not disappear, nor did it remain as it had been. Instead, it seemed to soften at its edges, as though becoming part of something larger. Ilarion stepped forward. The ground beneath his feet held firm, but the world was not quite the same. The passage beyond was not like those he had walked before. There were no walls in the usual sense, though the space still felt contained. The light was neither that of morning nor shadow, but something in between, as if drawn from both and belonging fully to neither. The ground extended ahead in a gentle curve. its surface smooth, marked only by faint lines that shifted as he moved, never forming a fixed pattern. Ilarion walked. There was no sound of wind here, no movement of leaves or water. And yet, the space did not feel empty. It held a presence, not of something watching, but of something that existed quietly alongside him. After some distance, he noticed the path beginning to branch, not in clear divisions, but in subtle variations, slight differences in the way the ground curved, in the direction the light seemed to favor. He slowed. The map, he knew, would not guide him here, nor would the compass. Instead, he stood for a moment, allowing his gaze to move across the space, not searching, but observing. One path curved gently to the right, its surface slightly darker, as though shadow lingered there a moment longer. Another extended forward, nearly straight, though its edges seemed to waver faintly, as if the space itself shifted along its length. A third turned left, narrower, its line less certain. Ilarion did not choose at once. He stepped forward, then paused again, his attention settling not on the paths themselves, but on the sense they carried. The forward path felt continuous. The one to the right held a weight, subtle but present. The left, quieter, though not in absence, but in something more delicate. He turned slightly, considering each. Then, without hesitation, he stepped onto the forward path. Time moved differently here, not faster nor slower, but without clear measure. The light did not change in any obvious way, and the distance he covered did not align with the rhythm of ordinary travel. Ilarion walked on. At intervals, shapes appeared at the edges of the path, suggestions of structures perhaps, or remnants of places that had once held form. They did not remain long enough to be fully seen, nor did they vanish entirely. They simply passed. At one point, he thought he saw the outline of a narrow bridge, its form arching lightly over an unseen space. But as he drew nearer, it became only a shift in the ground, then nothing at all. He did not follow it. The path beneath his feet remained steady, even as the space around it shifted in quiet ways. After a time, though how much could not be said, the ground began to change again. The faint lines upon its surface grew more defined, forming gentle patterns that echoed those he had seen upon the map. The air carried a different weight now, not heavier, but more anchored, as though the path was drawing closer to something, or perhaps returning from it. Ilarion slowed. Ahead, the light altered once more. This time it did not simply shift, it opened. A faint glow appeared at the edge of the path, not bright, but distinct, like the first glimpse of morning beyond a ridge. He moved toward it. As he did, the space around him began to settle. The shifting patterns grew still, the faint impressions along the path aligning into something more familiar. The presence that had accompanied him did not vanish. But it receded slightly, as though remaining behind while allowing him to continue forward. Ilarion reached the edge of the light. For a moment, he paused, not out of uncertainty, but in acknowledgement. Then he stepped through. The world returned, not abruptly, but with a quiet continuity, as though it had always been there, waiting just beyond the threshold. The ground beneath his feet was once again earth and stone. The air carried the scent of distant hills, and a faint breeze moved across the land, brushing lightly against the grass. Ilarion stood upon the slope of a ridge. Behind him, the space he had passed through left no visible trace, no opening, no mark. Only the memory of its presence remained. He turned his gaze outward. The land stretched before him in long, rolling lines, the Misty Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks touched by the soft light of early day. Valleys lay between them, deep and winding, their paths hidden from view. Somewhere within those lands and the hidden paths continued. Ilarion adjusted the satchel at his side. The map was still there, the silver leaf. But the disc... He paused. It was no longer within the satchel. He did not search for it. The path had taken it where it was meant to remain. Ilarion's gaze moved once more across the land before him. The journey was no longer beginning. It had already begun. And the road ahead was waiting. The ridge stretched quietly beneath Ilarion's feet, its slope descending in long, patient lines toward the valleys below. The light of early day moved across the land without haste, touching stone and grass alike, revealing their forms without urgency. He remained where he stood for a while, not from hesitation, but from a simple awareness of where he had arrived. Behind him, the path had closed. Not in denial nor in absence, but as something complete in its passing. Ahead, the world opened in a way that felt both familiar and newly shaped, as though the land itself held more than it revealed at first glance. Ilarion took a step forward. The ground answered as it always had, firm, steady, present. And yet, beneath that certainty, there lingered the quiet understanding that not all paths were seen. He began his descent. The slope was gentle, its surface broken by scattered stones and low patches of grass that shifted faintly with the movement of the air. No clear trail marked his way, but the direction did not require one. He moved as he had before, attentive, unhurried, guided by something that did not need to be named. As he descended, the sounds of the world returned more fully. A distant bird crossed the sky, its call carried lightly across the open space. The wind moved through the valley below, brushing against unseen trees. Its presence felt more than heard. Ilarion's steps continued. After some distance, he reached a narrow ledge that curved along the side of the ridge. From here, the land below became more defined, a winding line of trees tracing the path of a river, their shapes forming a soft boundary between open ground and deeper shadow. He followed the ledge. At one point he paused, his gaze drawn to a small arrangement of stones near the edge. They were not placed in any deliberate pattern, nor did they bear markings like those he had seen before. And yet, something about their position felt familiar. He crouched slightly, examining them. One stone rested upon another at a slight angle, its surface worn smooth, its edges softened. There was nothing remarkable about it. And still, Ilarion reached out, adjusting the stone just enough to alter its angle. For a brief moment, the light shifted across its surface, revealing a faint line, a marking so subtle it might have been mistaken for a natural fracture. A single line. He straightened slowly. The mark did not remain visible as the light moved on, but it did not need to. Ilarion continued along the ledge. The descent brought him eventually to the valley floor, where the air carried a cooler tone, touched by the presence of water not far away. The ground here was softer, the earth marked by the faint impressions of passing creatures, though none had come recently. He moved toward the line of trees. As he entered their shade, the light dimmed slightly, filtered through branches that reached across the space above. The air held a quiet stillness, though not an absence of sound, rather a sense that the sounds that existed here were not meant to carry far. Ilarion walked between the trees. The river revealed itself gradually, its surface moving in a steady, unbroken flow. It curved gently through the valley, its path shaped by the land in ways that felt both natural and intentional. He approached its edge. For a moment he stood there, looking down at the water as it passed. It did not reflect the sky as clearly as the stream in Rivendell had. The surface here was more textured, its movement catching the light in shifting fragments. Ilarion knelt slightly. His hand hovered just above the water. Then, with a small, deliberate motion, he let his fingers touch the surface. The current moved around them without resistance. And for a brief instant, just beneath the flow, there came a faint impression, so subtle it might have been imagined. A line, curving gently, continuing beyond the visible course of the river. Ilarion withdrew his hand. The surface returned to its ordinary motion. He did not reach for the map. He did not need to. He stood, turning his gaze along the direction of the river's path. Somewhere ahead, the hidden routes continued their quiet passage through the land, crossing hills and valleys, appearing and fading, never entirely fixed, yet never entirely lost. Ilarion stepped away from the water. The trees thinned as he moved onward, giving way once more to open ground. The day had begun to settle into its fuller light now, though it remained soft, the sun still low above the distant peaks. His path did not demand urgency. It did not call for speed. It simply allowed him to continue. At times, the ground beneath his feet seemed to guide him more clearly, forming slight inclines or subtle curves that aligned with his movement. At others, the direction became less certain, and he would slow, allowing the sense of the path to return before taking the next step. In this way, the journey unfolded. Not as a single road stretching from one place to another, but as a series of quiet continuations, each leading naturally into the next. The map, rolled within his satchel, remained untouched. The silver leaf rested beside it, and though the disc was no longer with him, its presence had not vanished. It lingered in the memory of the threshold, in the understanding of what lay between seen and unseen. Ilarion walked on. The land shifted gradually around him, rising and falling, opening and closing, offering new shapes without demanding that they be fully known. The mountains in the distance held their place upon the horizon, their forms steady, their presence constant. He did not aim for them. Not yet. There were paths between here and there, paths that would reveal themselves in their own time. As the day moved forward, the world settled into a quiet rhythm. The wind passed over the land in long, gentle motions. The light traced its slow arc across stone and grass. The river continued its steady course, unseen now, but still present somewhere beyond the folds of the valley. Ilarion's steps followed that rhythm, unbroken, unforced. At length he came to a rise in the land, a small elevation from which the surrounding terrain could be seen in wider measure. He ascended it, pausing at its crest. Before him the land stretched onward. No single path marked the way, and yet there was no absence, only possibility. Ilarion stood there for a while, his gaze steady, his presence aligned with the space around him. Then, with the same quiet certainty that had carried him from Rivendell's halls to this distant place, he stepped forward once more. The path did not appear before him, but it did not need to. It continued, as it always had, unseen and waiting.